Good morning and welcome to this Motec webinar. My name is Dwayne Mitchell and I work in the Motec Research Centre in Melbourne, Australia. The topic for today's webinar is how to configure lights with a PDM. Okay, in this webinar we're going to cover a number of topics fairly briefly, but we'll give you an idea of the following. Firstly, what type of lights we can control with a PDM, how much current we might expect each of these systems to draw, how we can arrange high beam, low beam switching, what we can do with driving lights, also how we can operate indicator and hazard lights, tail lights, dash lights, and finally how we would use rain lights and pit limit type lights, which are of course a flashing light, and lastly how we might flash headlights. So many of these tasks are quite similar to each other, but there are a few subtleties that are worth covering. Now, just quickly, Motec is an Australian company. We've been manufacturing here in Australia since 1987. We have a focus mostly on motorsport, but we do quite a lot of mid-level racing as well as road vehicle stuff. We have many dealers worldwide, and our research centre in Melbourne, Australia, which you can see pictured, has about 40 staff on site, including myself. Within our support engineer department, we have a number of staff. Once again, that's me down on the bottom. And each of these staff are capable of giving full support for all our engine management and data logging products, and also being able to respond to emails and use our forums as well. Okay, so the normal types of headlights or lights where we wish to deal with range from the older fashioned style of tungsten incandescent light bulbs, as you would see on older cars, right up to the current LED high intensity type lights. So the PDM itself, of course, doesn't need to distinguish between these, but they do all behave in slightly different ways. So the four types we'd look at are the tungsten bulbs, or the original, typically the 55 watt headlight bulbs. Then the halogen light bulbs, which are for example, the H4 styles, which would be somewhere between 50 and 100 watts. And then in the latter 10 or 15 years, we now have the HID xenon headlamps, and even more recently, LED type headlights. These are quite common on a lot of late model cars. So there are a number of things that differentiate how these lights work. One of them is how they turn on and how much current they pull in the initial phase, and then there is how much current they draw over a longer time. So typically the incandescent lamps might pull about 6 amps when they're starting, and this is because they have a very low resistance when they're cold, and then as they heat up and the illumination comes on, they'll pull a lot of current, and then they will drop down to maybe 2 or 3 amps. Again, if they're say 50 or 60 watts, that might be more like 4 or 5 amps. Halogen lamps also have a very low resistance when they're cold, and they pull a lot of current initially. We would say typically 11 amps for about 0.3 of a second, and then once again as they heat up, this current reduces down to maybe 3 or 4 amps. Of course, the same can be said for HID. So in most of these cases, we have a fairly significant current draw in the initial turn-on phase, and then over the longer term, the current is dropped. At present, we don't have a decent or reliable figure for LED headlights, so we haven't included that in our table. But this is another current profile that we'll be able to incorporate in future. If you look at the graph on the bottom, what we're looking at here is exactly what I've been discussing, which is the amount of current. And you can see here the initial spike, if you like, when the headlamps are turned on. They pull a lot of current for a very short amount of time, and then the current drops down to this level here, which is about 4.5 amps. So that's a very typical sort of current profile for a normal style of headlamp. As we can see, the HID globes also have a very long startup time. The way they operate is a little bit different. They pull a lot of current for about 10 seconds before they diminish down to say 3 amps. So this means that the way the PDM is going to be set up will have to be different because of the way it does its load profiling. But again, the PDM being capable of coping with high current surges in its general load profiling means that it can deal with all of these lamp styles without the equivalent of blowing a fuse. Okay, so to look at high beam and low beam systems, there are several ways that we would typically do this. Depending, of course, on the number of outputs you have available from your PDM, um, you may have to double some things up. But normally you would have a switch into the PDM which will turn the lights on and off, and then you might have a high beam and low beam select switch. So the most inefficient but practical way is to wire each lamp into a separate output, in which case you would require 4 outputs, for example, of 8 amps, and therefore you have your 2 left-hand side high beam and low beam lights and your 2 right-hand side high beam and low beam lights. And that's what we're looking at on the first diagram on the bottom, number 1. We have a light switch and a high-low beam switch, and then each of the individual lamps is powered from an output of the PDM. If you have sufficient outputs, this is probably the preferable way to do it, because you can individually monitor each of the lamps, and you can detect failures and so forth without having any compromise on the other lamps. Now, the second option would be to pair the outputs, and that is what we're showing in the second diagram. In this case, what we have is 2 high beams going into one of the 20 amp outputs. We have the 2 low beams going into another 20 amp output, and then we have our light switch and our high-low beam switch. So the difference here is that we're using fewer outputs from the PDM, but we also have slightly less ability to diagnose each of those individual lamps. Now, so this is, of course, a slightly less ideal way to do this. The third option, which would be one that may be required if you have a heavily loaded PDM and you are perhaps a little bit thin on output drives, would be to just simply have a light switch input and a single 20 amp output, which then goes via a high current high-low switch and then drives each of these lamps in parallel. So that only requires one output from the PDM, but of course it does introduce switching across a switch of high current, and it also means you can't analyze each of the lamps individually. In fact, you can only look at the pairs of lamps that are wired back into the PDM via the high-low switch. Once again, the options here are simply dependent on how many available outputs you have from the PDM and how much flexibility you need in your monitoring. Okay, so we can do similar things with indicator and hazard lights with a PDM. Again, it's a question of how many outputs you might have available on your PDM. You know, if you're running lots of fuel pumps and other devices, then you may have to economize on the number of outputs you can use. So, for example, with indicators and hazard lights, again, you can use 4 outputs, and the 8 amp outputs will be sufficient, 1 to each corner of the car. And again, you can monitor each of the lamps in this case, and if you lose a lamp, you won't be compromising the operation of any of the other lamps in the system. Again, if you use 2 outputs, you can wire up both right-hand side indicators to an output and both left-hand side indicators to an output. And again, this will reduce your output requirements, but also reduce the amount of monitoring capability you have. And finally, you could use 1 output, in which case you still need a switch which will divert the output to which of the relevant lamps you need to flash. So you can set up an 8 amp output to be flashing continuously, and then you have a 3-position switch, which is either off in the center position or is flashing the left indicators in one position and the right indicators in the other. This wouldn't allow you to run hazards, but this would allow you to run indicators off a single output. So if you need to run hazards as well, you need to use the logic capabilities of the PDM to integrate your indicator function with your hazard function, and therefore you need one of the first 2 modes, the 4 output mode or the 2 output mode, in which case you have another input to the PDM, which is the hazard light, and then you have a logic function which will run the left indicators if the left switch is on, the right indicator if the right switch is on, and all indicators if the hazards are on. So again, this is only possible if you have multiple output modes, not if you have a switched output, a switch from just one output on the PDM. Similarly with tail lights and park lights, these are all fairly low current type lights, And so it's not necessarily beneficial to have each of them being driven from a separate output of the PDM. You can actually just parallel them all together, run them off a single output. You can just have a single switch would turn all of these on and off. And now if you have an ADL connected, you can also use this switch across CAN, send it to the ADL, and then your ADL backlight can be switched at the same time you turn on your tail light switch. So there are a number of flexibility things here where we can use the CAN messaging to use one switch output to turn all of these functions on at the same time. You could also turn the brightness up and down. Similarly, if you turn on your tail lights, you can change the brightness on your shift light module. Okay, so the other thing we often need to do is have a rain light. This is obligatory in many racing classes, and if they declare a wet track, you need to flash this light whenever your pit lane speed limiter is active. Okay, this is quite a simple thing to achieve with a PDM. You just use an 8-put output to the rain light. You have a toggle switch which the driver can operate, and then whenever the pit request is being used, i.e. the pit lane speed limiter, you can receive that message into the PDM as a CAN message, and that will then enable the flashing of the output. So in our two diagrams on the right, we have two small screen grabs, and they are a little bit difficult to read, unfortunately. But one of them, the first one, the properties condition, which I'll just highlight. Okay, this one here. So this is the rain light output condition, and down here what we have is a logic statement which will flash that light and also activate it when the rain light switch message is true, as you can see down there. So that's just a simple logic statement. And then the second thing we have on the right hand side is the actual output drive for the same function. So these things are simple enough to do as a logic statement, and that enables us to have multiple functions being performed and receiving our message via CAN. Okay, another thing that's quite common in racing is for the driver to need to flash the headlights to indicate that the driver is approaching one in front and needs to pass, or needs to be at least have some awareness. This normally used to just be done by flashing the headlight switch, but of course with the PDM, we can set a flash routine which will have a certain period and a certain repetition, and that can then be activated by a switch. So firstly, you have an input going into the PDM, which can be either a switch or it can be a CAN message from your dashboard. And then you need to have a logic statement. In this case, we've called it headlight.flash.can input. I beg your pardon, that's the input message. And then we have a logic function which generates a flashing condition. In this case, again, it's a little bit hard to read, but up here what we have is a flashing rate, and we also have, if the CAN input is true, it will flash, and if the CAN input is false, it will not flash. So that's again a fairly straightforward thing which can be easily done with either a switch input or a CAN input. And then the headlights will flash appropriately without you having or the driver having to continually hit the button. Very straightforward with a PDM. Okay, that's all we're going to cover today. Fairly brief, but just an indication of what can be done and the most flexible ways to approach this. If you need any further information, it's worth looking at our webinars. This one, of course, is being recorded, and therefore you can replay it again if you need to, and that will allow you to stop and start the webinar and look at individual pages if you need to. We also have a very active web forum, and that can be accessed from the address you can see on the screen, and that will allow you to interact with other users of similar products. Our forums are divided up into applications and ECUs and so forth, so it's quite easy to firstly do searches on things you may be interested in, and secondly to interact. And our technical support staff here are on that forum frequently, if not every day, and therefore most of the queries that get brought up on the forum can be answered very promptly. And finally, of course, you can contact us by email or telephone if you need to. Thank you very much for attending. That's the end of this webinar.